10, 11, and 12. The majority of the questions, no, I shouldn't say that. Not the majority, given the election of 24. The most questions come out of Chapter 10. Chapter 10 is the Washington administration, the Adams administration. I think it goes all the way through Jefferson's election. I think 11 starts with Jefferson's election, or Jefferson's administration, and goes through the War of 1812. And then I think 12 starts with the actual fighting of the War of 1812 and the aftermath of the War of 1812. So the most questions, not the majority, but the most questions come out of 10. And 10 started with Washington taking office. If you remember, the context for this unit was that the United States shed the Articles of Confederation and adopted a new Constitution. And we made the point when we kind of first started that this is an important juncture. That for one reason or another, things seem to be becoming unraveled under the Articles of Confederation, Shays' Rebellion, concerns about state governments taking license with their authority, created an environment where people said that, or some argued, that the Articles of Confederation needed replaced with a stronger central government, which was the Constitution. Just a quick aside. To some extent, that constitutional movement is a backlash against, kind of the revolution. The revolution that unleashed these notions of democracy and equality. The Constitution was kind of saying, well, these ideas need to be checked in some cases. The passions of the people might need to be checked by a stronger national government. And so now the question was, could the Republican experiment, would it endure with the government under the constraints of the Constitution? And we said the test of that would come by the first elected officials. And we said whatever that first Congress and that first president did would be precedent. And we said also that Washington, is unanimously elected to be the first president, and the things that he does and the things that Congress does are going to be important in sort of solidifying and establishing this government under the Constitution. Now, in terms of Washington, we really said that there were 4 challenges. Right? We said there were 4 challenges. What Washington had to do was convince the Anti-Federalists. Well, we shouldn't say what Washington had to do. What the members of the first government had to do. Congress, a House, a Senate, and the President had to do was convince the Anti-Federalists that their liberties were safe. We said that was true. We said also that the first government had to give structure and life to the Constitution. The Constitution was an outline of government. The details had to be filled in. We also said that first government had to address the issues of finance and debt. And then lastly, that first government had to establish the United States in the world, in the community of nations. In terms of filling in the structure of government, one of the things the first Congress does is create departments of the national government. Department of State, Department of Treasury, Department of War. Now, what Washington does is draw upon those department heads as a formal council of advisors. He creates a cabinet. Now, there's nothing in the Constitution about a cabinet. I mean, there is the authority of Congress to create departments of government. There is a stipulation that there will be secretaries of these departments. But the fact that the secretaries of these departments became advisors to the president is extra-constitutional and represents the establishment of something in the government. And we talked a little bit about that. Oh, just for fun, who was Washington's first Secretary of State? Or who was the first Secretary of State in the Secretary of State in the Washington administration papers? Jefferson. Okay, Sri, who was the Secretary of Treasury? Hamilton. And the Secretary of War? Henry Knox. And the Attorney General was Edmund Randolph. And we said that Randolph, the Attorney General, was a little lesser of a position. So we talked about the establishment. We also talked about the Judicial Act of 1789 and how the Judicial Act of 1789 established the federal court system. And then we talked about the Bill of Rights. And the Bill of Rights are going to be 10 amendments to the Constitution that are promised by the Federalist supporters of the Constitution to the anti-federalist opponents of the Constitution during the constitutional debate. Who was most responsible for guiding the Bill of Rights through the House and through the Senate and being submitted eventually to the states and ratified? Who was really the father of the Bill of Rights, or the architect of the Bill of Rights? Go ahead. Madison. Madison is the father of the Constitution and is largely responsible for eventually 10 amendments to the Constitution being sent to the states for ratification, which become the Bill of Rights, which is the assurance that anti-federalists are looking for. Now, we talked about the amendments, and we said, look, the first 10 amendments to the Constitution are the Bill of Rights, and the First Amendment is freedom of speech, freedom of the press. Second Amendment was, right to bear arms, Fifth Amendment, self-incrimination. These are popular ones. But we said that Jefferson was most interested in the Ninth Amendment. Does anybody remember what we said was in the Ninth Amendment that was of some concern to Jefferson? Anyone besides Alex and myself? Go ahead, Alex.
It was any powers that are not specifically listed to be given to the states or peoples.
Well, no, that was the 10th. But, and that's important too. We were just going to ask about that. Yes? Yes. What Bill said is, the Ninth Amendment said, look, just because a right was not listed as being specifically protected from government didn't mean that people didn't possess that right. So the fact that some right might be left out of the Bill of Rights didn't necessarily mean that people or citizens didn't enjoy that right. The 10th Amendment, Alex, said that anything that wasn't specifically listed as a responsibility of the national government automatically deferred to the states or to the people. Now, that leads us to the problem of debt and the problem of finance. And who was largely responsible for dealing with that problem, dear Coulter? The problem of debt, the problem of finance was something that fell on the shoulders of whom? Hamilton. And Congress actually asked Hamilton to prepare a report on public credit. And out of that report on public credit came two proposals. Does anybody remember what they were? Two proposals. Hamilton reports to Congress on public credit. How are we going to deal with this massive debt? He proposes two things. Go ahead.
Funding at par and assumption.
Yes, funding at par and assumption. Now, funding at par was basically refinancing the debt at 100% of the face value plus any interest that was owed. What was assumption, dear Murray? You do not recall. Fassetti, were you conscious during the discussion of...
Wasn't it the federal government assumed all state debts?
Yes, that's exactly right. You must have been. Yes, the assumption was the notion that the federal government would assume all the debts that the states had incurred. Remember, the debts that government owed at every level were basically bonds that had been issued by those governments and bought by various people. Now, those bonds had been bought and sold by the time these proposals were put forward, but basically what Hamilton was proposing is it didn't matter who had issued the bond. Whether it had been the national government or the state government, the United States government was going to refinance all of those securities in a new government and assure that that government would pay 100% of the face value. And what was wrong with that proposal? It sounds like it's a pretty good proposal, but there was opposition to it. What did the opposition to that proposal? Where did it come from? Go ahead, JR.
Speculators had bought bonds.
What dear JR had said is speculators had purchased those bonds from the original holders at less than the face value of those bonds, and this proposal would allow them to make, or would enable them to make, considerable profits. Some people like Hamilton and Jefferson didn't like this. And what we argued, to some extent, was that Hamilton's financial proposals was the genesis of really political parties. Up until Hamilton's financial proposals, which really is 1791, the idea of organized political factions was not something that people expected to occur in the new country. But political divisions started to occur over these proposals. I mean, Madison took an active role in opposing them. He began to organize people to criticize them. And those sort of embryonic organizations eventually blossom into parties, which is significant. Beyond assumption and funding the national debt at par, we said one of the other controversial proposals that Hamilton made was that the federal government would charter a national bank, the first bank of the United States. The first bank of the United States was passed by the House and by the Senate in 1791. It made it to Washington's desk. Washington considered vetoing that legislation. Then, why? Why did Washington consider vetoing that legislation?
It was unconstitutional.
He suspected, or he was concerned about the constitutionality of creating a bank. Ben, can you tell us why he was concerned about it?
Because the Constitution didn't declare the government to have the right to make a bank.
What dear Ben has said is that, look, nowhere in the Constitution does it say that the national government has the power to charter banks or businesses. And basically, if you go by the 10th Amendment, Alex, if it doesn't say that the national government has that power, then that power reverts to the states. So did the national government have the authority under the Constitution to create a national bank? And this was the question that Washington asked to Hamilton and to Jefferson. What did Jefferson say? Simple response? No. What did Hamilton say? Simple response? Yes. So Jefferson said, no, the national government did not have that authority. Jefferson said, yes, the national government did have that authority. Now, the argument between Jefferson and Hamilton over the constitutionality of the national bank exposes the loose and the strict interpretation of the Constitution. Jefferson argued that the national government did not have the authority to charter banks and businesses because nowhere in the Constitution was that authority stated. That's what we call the strict interpretation. If it doesn't say it, the national government can't do it. The strict interpretation of the Constitution, by its very nature, would weaken the power of the national government. If you strictly interpret the Constitution, the national government's power would be absolutely limited to only those things that were specifically mentioned as their powers. Now, Hamilton said, yes, nowhere in the Constitution does it say that the national government has the authority to charter banks and businesses. But there is a clause in the Constitution that says that the national government or Congress has the authority to do those things that are necessary and proper. Oh, what's that clause called? Do you remember? The elastic clause. The elastic clause in the Constitution said that Congress had the authority to do what is necessary and proper to do the things that are listed in the Constitution. And what Hamilton said is Congress has the specific authority to regulate trade. Congress has the specific authority to create currency. And in order to do that, a bank might be necessary and proper, therefore constitutional. Washington took Hamilton's advice, signed the legislation, 1791. That first bank of the United States was chartered for a 20-year period. In addition to assumption, funding the national debt at par, and a national bank, we also said that Hamilton proposed a series of excise taxes to help finance, these financial initiatives. One of those excise taxes was a tax on whiskey. And we said that that tax on whiskey eventually results in opposition. Pennsylvania distillers do not want to pay the whiskey tax. They actively and defiantly oppose it. They resist any kind of legal efforts to enforce it, and eventually the result is what we call the Whiskey Rebellion. The Whiskey Rebellion is when Washington dispatches an army of 13,000 soldiers to go to western Pennsylvania to crush the defiance against that tax. Certainly we mentioned that the Whiskey Rebellion and Washington's response was controversial. To the opponents of the national government, the kind of burgeoning Republican Party, who saw Hamilton's financial proposals as a way for a small group of Americans to benefit using the national government, they saw Washington's actions as being oppressive.